Somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, on a clear November morning in 2004, one of the most decorated and experienced fighter pilots in United States Navy history encountered something that changed his life forever. Commander David Fravor, a man who had logged thousands of hours in some of the most advanced aircraft ever built by human hands, looked out of his cockpit and saw something that should not exist. Something that moved without wings. Something that had no visible propulsion system. Something that accelerated from a dead hover to beyond the horizon in less than 1 second. Something that the United States Pentagon itself would later confirm was absolutely real. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not the ramblings of a confused civilian who saw a weather balloon at dusk. This is the sworn testimony of a United States Navy commander with a spotless record, corroborated by multiple pilots, multiple radar operators, and backed by declassified government video footage. What Commander David Fravor saw that morning over the Pacific has never been explained. Not by the Navy, not by the Pentagon, not by the most brilliant scientists and aerospace engineers on the planet. And tonight, we are going to go through every single detail of that encounter, from the moment the radar operators first picked up the anomaly, to the classified investigation that followed, to what the United States government quietly admitted when they thought nobody was watching. Stay with me, because what you are about to hear is the most credible, most documented, most thoroughly investigated unidentified aerial phenomenon in the entire history of the United States military. And when we are done, you will never look at the sky the same way again. Let us go back to the beginning, not to 2004. Let us go back further, because to truly understand the weight and significance of what Commander Fravor encountered, you need to understand who David Fravor is as a man, as a pilot, and as a military officer. David Fravor did not stumble into the cockpit of an FA-18F Super Hornet by accident. He earned his place there through years of grueling training, relentless dedication, and a level of mental discipline that most human beings will never come close to achieving. He was a graduate of the United States Naval Academy. He had served in the First Gulf War. He had thousands of flight hours under his belt. He was, by every objective measure, exactly the kind of witness that you would want if you were trying to establish credibility in an event of extraordinary magnitude. His superiors trusted him. His peers respected him. His crew would have followed him into any situation without hesitation. This is the man who, on the morning of November 14, 2004, climbed into his aircraft and flew out to meet something that defied every law of physics he had ever been taught. The USS Nimitz Carrier Strike Group had been deployed to the Pacific Ocean for routine training operations. The Nimitz, for those who may not be familiar, is not a small vessel. It is a nuclear-powered supercarrier, one of the most powerful warships ever constructed by any nation in human history. Accompanying the Nimitz was the USS Princeton, a guided missile cruiser equipped with the AN Spy-1 radar system, one of the most sophisticated and capable radar systems ever deployed by the United States Navy. For approximately 2 weeks before the incident on November 14th, the radar operators aboard the USS Princeton had been tracking something extraordinary. Objects were appearing on their radar screens at altitudes of approximately 80,000 feet. That is higher than most commercial aircraft fly. That is higher than most military aircraft fly. These objects would then descend rapidly, sometimes dropping from 80,000 feet to just a few hundred feet above the ocean surface in a matter of seconds. The radar operators initially assumed there was a malfunction in their equipment. They ran diagnostics. They checked and rechecked their systems. Everything was working perfectly. The objects were real, they were there, and nobody had any idea what they were. Senior Chief Kevin Day was the operations specialist aboard the USS Princeton responsible for overseeing the radar systems during that deployment. He would later describe what he saw on those radar screens as unlike anything he had encountered in his entire military career. He described objects appearing at extreme altitude, moving at extraordinary speeds, maneuvering in ways that no known aircraft could possibly maneuver, and then simply disappearing from the radar screen before reappearing somewhere else entirely. Day was troubled enough by what he was seeing that he brought it to the attention of his commanding officers. The decision was made that the next time these objects appeared, they would scramble aircraft to intercept them and get a visual confirmation of what was being tracked on radar. That decision led directly to the events of November 14, 2004. Commander Fravor was launched from the Nimitz that morning along with his wingman, Commander Jim Slate. Each pilot had a weapons systems officer in the backseat of their aircraft. Fravor's WSO was Lieutenant Commander Alex Dietrich, who would later add her own corroborating testimony to the account of what happened that day. The four of them were on a routine training mission when they received a call from the Princeton, directing them to investigate an unidentified aerial contact approximately 60 miles away. The controller on the Princeton, a man named Petty Officer Gary Voorhees, was watching the radar contact as Fravor and Slate flew toward it. Voorhees would later describe the object's behavior on radar as nothing he had ever seen in his career. It was not following any flight path. It was not behaving like any aircraft he had ever tracked. It simply appeared to be hovering, then moving, then hovering again, with no apparent pattern and no apparent awareness of or reaction to the approaching Navy aircraft. When Commander Fravor arrived at the coordinates he had been given, he expected to find nothing. He expected a radar glitch, a weather phenomenon, perhaps a rogue weather balloon that had drifted into restricted airspace. What he found instead was something that he would spend the rest of his life trying to explain. The ocean beneath him was disturbed. There was a large area of churning white water on the surface of the Pacific, roughly the size of a Boeing 737 airplane. This churning was not caused by wind or weather. The sea state around it was relatively calm. Something beneath the surface, or something that had recently been beneath the surface, was causing that disturbance. And hovering approximately 50 feet above that churning water was an object unlike anything Commander Fravor had ever seen. He later described it as white, smooth, and oblong, roughly the size and shape of a tic-tac breath mint. Hence the name that would eventually be given to this incident, the tic-tac UFO. The object was approximately 40 feet long. It had no wings. It had no visible tail. It had no control surfaces of any kind. There was no exhaust plume, no heat signature visible to the naked eye, no sound that could be heard over the roar of the FA-18's engines. It was simply there, hovering effortlessly above the churning ocean, seemingly indifferent to the presence of the two United States Navy fighter jets that had just arrived on scene. Fravor made the decision to descend toward the object to get a closer look. As he began his descent, something happened that he still describes with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The object reacted to him. It was not a passive, indifferent reaction. It was deliberate, calculated, and showed an awareness of his presence that suggested some form of intelligence guiding its movements. As Fravor descended toward it, the object began to ascend toward him, mirroring his movements as if engaged in some kind of aerial dance. Fravor cut across the circle he was flying to try to get closer to the object, to cut off its movement. The object responded instantly. Before Fravor could complete his maneuver, before he could get anywhere near it, the object accelerated. There is no other word that adequately captures what happened next, because the object did not simply move away. It vanished. In the time it takes you to blink your eyes, the object went from a hover above the ocean's surface to a point so far away that it was no longer visible to the naked eye. Commander Fravor, flying an FA-18F Super Hornet, one of the fastest aircraft in the United States Navy inventory, had been left standing still. He turned to his WSO. He turned to his wingman's aircraft. And then he said, over the radio, in the calm, measured voice of a man who has been trained to remain composed in the most extreme situations imaginable, "I want to fly where that thing came from." They flew to the coordinates above the churning water. There was nothing there. The object was gone. The ocean's surface was still churned and disturbed, but whatever had been beneath it, whatever had been hovering above it, was simply no longer present. Fravor and Slate completed their training mission and returned to the Nimitz. When they landed and debriefed, Fravor told his superiors exactly what he had seen. He did not embellish. He did not speculate. He described what he had witnessed with the same precision and clarity that he brought to every mission report he had ever filed. And the response from his commanding officers was not disbelief. It was not dismissal. It was something far more unsettling. His superiors told him that what he had just described matched exactly what the radar operators had been tracking for 2 weeks, but the story does not end there. While Fravor and Slate were still completing their training mission, a second section of aircraft was launched from the Nimitz to take over the investigation of the contact. One of those aircraft was equipped with the FLIR pod, the forward-looking infrared camera system that would eventually produce the footage that the entire world would come to know as the FLIR-1 video, or the Nimitz UFO video. The pilot of that aircraft picked up the object on his FLIR system. What the infrared camera captured is extraordinary. The object can be seen moving through the air, rotating on its axis, accelerating and performing maneuvers that no known aircraft can replicate. The FLIR footage would remain classified for years. When it was eventually released, it would shake the foundations of the UFO debate and force the United States government to acknowledge, for the first time in its history, that it did not know what these objects were. Now let us talk about the physics. Because this is where the story becomes truly staggering in its implications. Commander Fravor described an object that went from a stationary hover to a speed that made it invisible to the naked eye in less than 1 second. Modern fighter jets, including the F/A-18F Super Hornet that Fravor was flying that day, are limited in how fast they can accelerate, not because of the power of their engines, but because of the physical limitations of the human body. A human pilot can withstand approximately 9 times the force of gravity, what pilots call 9 gs, before losing consciousness. At that level of acceleration, blood is forced away from the brain, and unconsciousness follows rapidly. The object that Fravor witnessed accelerating away from him was performing maneuvers that would have generated hundreds of gs of force if a human pilot had been inside. No human being could survive that. No known material strong enough to contain a human pilot could withstand those forces without shattering. Whatever was propelling that object, whatever was guiding it, it was operating under a completely different set of physical constraints than anything the United States military had ever encountered. Dr. Kevin Nuth, a former NASA scientist and professor of physics at the University of Albany, analyzed the performance data from the Nimitz encounter and published his findings in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. His analysis concluded that the object was performing maneuvers that required accelerations of approximately 5,000 to 7,000 times the force of gravity. For context, the fastest acceleration ever sustained by a human being in a controlled environment is somewhere around 45 gs, and that was for a fraction of a second, and it nearly killed the man involved. 5,000 to 7,000 gs, that is not a malfunction, that is not a misidentification, that is a technology gap so vast that it staggers the imagination. And there is another dimension to this encounter that is often overlooked when people discuss the Nimitz incident. When Commander Fravor returned to the Nimitz after his encounter, he learned that the FLIR footage taken by the second section of aircraft had been recorded onto data storage devices and held in the ship's intelligence section. Within hours of the event, men appeared aboard the Nimitz whom no one recognized. They identified themselves as intelligence personnel, though their exact agency affiliation was never made clear to the crew. These men went directly to the intelligence section, collected every piece of recorded data related to the encounter, including the radar tapes from the Princeton, the FLIR footage, and the communications recordings, and they left the ship. No one ever explained who they were. No one ever explained under what authority they had taken the data. And for years afterward, the official position of the United States Navy was that the encounter had never happened. Let us pause here and consider what that means. This was not a UFO sighting reported by a farmer in a field somewhere in the rural Midwest. This was an encounter involving multiple naval officers, multiple radar systems, multiple aircraft, and physical evidence in the form of recorded video footage. And within hours of the encounter, unnamed intelligence personnel appeared from nowhere, collected all the evidence, and disappeared. This is not a detail that conspiracy theorists invented. This is something that Commander Fravor himself and multiple other witnesses have testified to under oath and in public forums. The years between 2004 and 2017 were a period of enforced silence for the crew of the Nimitz. The official position remained that nothing of significance had occurred. The data had been collected. The incident had been classified. And the men and women who had witnessed one of the most extraordinary events in military aviation history were expected to go about their lives as though nothing had happened. But something had happened, and the people who experienced it knew it. Commander Fravor, to his enormous credit, never let it go. He talked about the encounter in private with colleagues and friends, though always carefully, always aware of the potential professional consequences of speaking publicly about a classified event. He was not afraid of being disbelieved. He was afraid of being silenced before the truth could come out. Then, in 2017, everything changed. On December 16, 2017, the New York Times published a bombshell article that would alter the course of public conversation about UFOs forever. The article revealed the existence of a secret Pentagon program called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, or AATIP, which had been operating within the Department of Defense since 2007. AATIP had been quietly investigating unidentified aerial phenomena for a decade. Its budget of $22 million per year had been allocated through a classified earmark by then Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid. The program had been run by a Defense Intelligence Agency official named Luis Elizondo, and alongside the article, the New York Times published 2 pieces of classified video footage. One of them was the FLIR-1 video from the Nimitz encounter in 2004. The other was a separate incident involving a different set of Navy pilots encountering a similar object off the East Coast. The release of that article and that footage was an earthquake. Commander Fravor, who had been waiting for years for the opportunity to speak publicly about what he had witnessed, came forward immediately. He gave interviews, he testified before members of Congress, he appeared on podcasts and television programs and in documentary films, and in every single one of those appearances, his account was exactly the same. Not similar, not roughly consistent, exactly the same. Word for word, detail for detail, in the precise, methodical manner of a man who is describing something he actually witnessed rather than something he invented or embellished. His credibility was and remains unimpeachable. Luis Elizondo, the man who had run the AATIP program, also came forward publicly. He resigned from the Pentagon in protest over what he described as excessive secrecy and resistance within the Department of Defense to taking the UAP phenomenon seriously. He confirmed that the FLIR-1 video was genuine. He confirmed that the radar data from the Princeton was genuine. He confirmed that the encounter described by Commander Fravor had been investigated by his program and that no explanation had ever been found. He further stated, and this is perhaps the most chilling detail of the entire story, that the Nimitz encounter was not unique, that similar encounters had been documented by military pilots going back decades. That the United States government had been aware of these objects for far longer than the public had been told. Now let us examine what the Navy itself eventually acknowledged. In September 2019, the United States Navy took the extraordinary step of officially confirming that the 3 videos released by the New York Times in 2017, the FLIR-1 video, the gimbal video, and the GOFAST video, genuine recordings of objects that the Navy could not identify. In a statement to various media outlets, Navy spokesperson Joe Gradisher confirmed that the objects in the videos were unidentified aerial phenomena. That statement, those 3 words, unidentified aerial phenomena, coming from an official spokesperson for the United States Navy, represented a seismic shift in the government's public position on UFOs. For decades, the official position had been dismissal, misidentification. Weather phenomena, swamp gas. Now suddenly, here was the Navy of the United States of America saying on the record that these things were real and that they did not know what they were. The implications of that statement are worth sitting with for a moment. The United States Navy operates some of the most sophisticated radar and sensor systems on the planet. Its pilots are among the best trained aviators in human history. Its intelligence analysts have access to data that no civilian organization can match. And yet the official position, confirmed in writing by a spokesperson speaking for the entire organization, was that these objects were unidentified. They did not know what they were, they could not explain them, and by extension, they could not defend against them. That last point is perhaps the most significant, and it is the one that tends to get lost in the broader public conversation about UAPs. These encounters are not occurring over empty stretches of ocean where they pose no potential threat to national security. They are occurring in and around restricted military airspace, in close proximity to some of the most sensitive and valuable military assets the United States possesses. If an adversarial nation had developed technology capable of penetrating military airspace, approaching a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, and outmaneuvering the most advanced fighter jets in the American inventory, that would represent the most catastrophic failure of intelligence and military superiority in the history of the United States Armed Forces. No adversary on Earth, not China, not Russia, not any nation that the intelligence community is aware of, has demonstrated any capability that comes remotely close to what was observed in the Nimitz encounter. Which brings us to the uncomfortable question that hangs over this entire story like a storm cloud that never quite breaks. If it is not ours, and if it is not theirs, then whose is it? Commander Fravor has been asked that question hundreds of times. His answer is always the same. He does not speculate, he does not claim to know what the object was. He says with absolute conviction that it was not from this world as he knows it. He means that precisely. He is not claiming it was extraterrestrial. He is saying that in his experience, in his knowledge of aviation technology, in everything he understands about what human beings are capable of building and flying, the object he encountered does not fit anywhere in that framework. It exists outside of everything he knows, and that, from a man of his experience and expertise, is perhaps the most unsettling statement of all. Let us now examine the broader context of the government's evolving response to the UAP phenomenon in the years following the release of the Nimitz footage. The establishment of the AATIP program in 2007 was itself a remarkable event. The fact that senior members of the United States Senate, including Harry Reid, Ted Stevens, and Daniel Inouye, felt it necessary to allocate classified funds to investigate aerial phenomena suggests that they had access to information or had heard testimony that convinced them this was a matter of genuine national security importance. Reid has stated publicly that he believes the government possesses physical materials recovered from UAP incidents. He has been careful with his language, but the implication is unmistakable. In June 2021, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released a preliminary assessment of UAPs that had been requested by Congress. The document was remarkable not for what it revealed, but for what it admitted it could not explain. Of 144 UAP incidents examined by the assessment, only one could be explained with high confidence. The remaining 143 remained unidentified. The report noted that UAPs clearly posed a flight safety issue and a potential national security challenge. It identified 5 potential categories of explanation: airborne clutter, natural atmospheric phenomena, United States government or industry developmental programs, foreign adversary systems, and a 5th category labeled Other, which the report described as a catch-all for any event that could not be explained by the first 4 categories. The Nimitz incident and encounters like it fell squarely into that 5th category. The congressional hearings on UAPs that began in 2022 brought additional testimony into the public record that further complicated and deepened the mystery surrounding the Nimitz encounter and others like it. Retired Navy Commander Scott Bray, then the Deputy Director of Naval Intelligence, testified before the House Intelligence Committee that the number of UAP incidents in the military's database had grown from 144 to over 400 in the period between the 2021 report and the 2022 hearing. He showed previously unreleased videos of UAP encounters to the committee members. He acknowledged that some of the objects had displayed what he called unusual flight characteristics. He could not explain what they were. He could not explain how they operated. And he could not explain why, despite years of investigation and the deployment of some of the most sophisticated surveillance technology on the planet, the United States government was no closer to understanding them than it had been in 2004, when Commander Fravor first reported his encounter. Now let us turn our attention to the broader history of UAP encounters within the United States military, because the Nimitz incident did not occur in a vacuum. It was, in many ways, the culmination of decades of increasingly credible and increasingly well-documented encounters between military personnel and objects that defied conventional explanation. The modern history of what we now call UAPs arguably begins in 1947, with the wave of sightings that followed Kenneth Arnold's famous observation of 9 crescent-shaped objects flying near Mount Rainier in Washington state. Arnold described their movement as like a saucer skipping across water, which is where the term flying saucer originally came from. His account sparked a nationwide wave of similar reports and prompted the United States Air Force to begin the first official government investigation into aerial phenomena, a project that would eventually become known as Project Blue Book. Project Blue Book operated from 1952 to 1969 and officially examined 12,618 reported UAP sightings. Of those, 701 were classified as unexplained even after exhaustive investigation. The program was officially terminated in 1969 with the conclusion that UAPs did not represent a threat to national security and were not evidence of extraterrestrial technology. But many of the scientists and investigators who had worked on the project publicly disagreed with that conclusion. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, the astronomer who served as scientific advisor to Project Blue Book and who initially approached the subject as a skeptic, came to believe by the end of his involvement that the unexplained cases represented a genuine scientific mystery worthy of serious investigation. He went on to found the Center for UFO Studies and spent the remainder of his life advocating for rigorous scientific examination of the phenomenon. The termination of Project Blue Book did not mean the end of UAP encounters within the military. It simply meant that the official framework for investigating and reporting them was dismantled. The encounters continued. The reports continued to be filed through unofficial channels, and the frustration of military pilots who had witnessed these objects and found no official mechanism for reporting them continued to grow. One of the most significant patterns to emerge from the historical record of military UAP encounters is the consistency of the described characteristics across incidents spanning decades and occurring in widely separated geographic locations. The objects described by Commander Fravor in 2004 bear a striking resemblance to objects described by military pilots in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. They are typically smooth, metallic in appearance, oblong or disc-shaped, with no visible propulsion system, no exhaust, no noise, and a capacity for acceleration and maneuverability that far exceeds any known human technology. Whatever these things are, they appear to have been consistent in their characteristics for an extraordinarily long period of time. Commander Fravor has been asked many times whether he finds this consistency across decades of encounters reassuring or troubling. His answer is typically that he finds it simply interesting. He is a man who deals in facts. He observed what he observed. He reported what he reported. The question of what it means, the broader philosophical and scientific implications of objects that appear to operate outside the known laws of physics appearing in military airspace over a period of many decades, is one that he is happy to leave to others. His job, as he sees it, was to be the most credible possible witness to the event that occurred on November 14, 2004, and in that, there is little doubt that he has succeeded. Let us now examine the specific technical details of the Nimitz encounter in greater depth, because the devil, as they say, is in the details. The radar data from the USS Princeton is perhaps the most objectively compelling element of the entire encounter. The AN-SPY-1 radar system aboard the Princeton is not a simple piece of equipment. It is a highly sophisticated, computer-controlled phased array radar system capable of simultaneously tracking hundreds of targets in the air and on the surface of the ocean. It is designed to be immune to spoofing and electronic countermeasures. When the Princeton's radar operators reported that they were tracking objects exhibiting extraordinary performance characteristics, they were not guessing. They were reading data from a system that is specifically designed to accurately characterize the speed, altitude, and trajectory of aerial targets. The data from the Princeton showed the UAPs dropping from altitudes above 80,000 feet to near sea level in times that implied descent rates far beyond anything achievable by known aircraft. It showed them hovering at stationary positions, which is something that a fixed-wing aircraft cannot do without specialized equipment like vectored thrust nozzles, and even then not with the effortless stability described by the radar operators. It showed them accelerating to speeds that the radar system could not accurately measure because they exceeded the parameters for which the system had been calibrated. These are not the readings you get from a weather balloon or a migrating flock of birds or a radar malfunction. These are the readings of objects performing maneuvers that require technology so far in advance of anything currently known that they represent not just a gap, but a chasm between what we know is possible and what was observed. FLIR-1 video itself, the infrared footage shot by the second section of aircraft that responded to the Nimitz encounter, has been analyzed by numerous independent experts since its public release in 2017. The analysis is consistently remarkable. The object in the footage shows no heat signature in the locations where a conventional propulsion system would produce one. There is no exhaust plume. There are no hot spots corresponding to engine nacelles or rocket nozzles. The object rotates on its axis in a manner that suggests it is not aerodynamically stable in the conventional sense, and yet it maintains its trajectory with perfect precision. It moves against the wind. It accelerates without any visible means of propulsion. It performs what appear to be controlled maneuvers that suggest guided flight rather than simple ballistic motion. Some skeptics have attempted to explain the FLIR-1 footage as a result of the camera system's own movement, suggesting that what appears to be the object maneuvering is actually the camera panning and rotating. These explanations have been examined and largely rejected by experts in FLIR systems. The behavior of the object in the footage is not consistent with camera motion artifacts. The object is genuinely moving in ways that a camera artifact would not produce. And crucially, the corroborating testimony of Commander Fravor, who observed the object directly with his naked eyes before the FLIR footage was taken, describes exactly the same characteristics. The same shape, the same absence of propulsion, the same extraordinary acceleration that the camera later captured. There is also the matter of the disturbance in the ocean surface that Fravor observed when he first arrived at the coordinates given to him by the Princeton. That churning water, roughly the size of a Boeing 737, directly below the hovering object, suggests that something very large had recently been in or just below the surface of the ocean. The possibility that the UAP was associated with some kind of underwater craft, that it was operating both above and below the ocean surface, is one that has been taken seriously by researchers and investigators. The term UAP itself, unidentified aerial phenomenon, may actually be too limiting a description for objects that appear capable of operating in multiple physical environments. Some researchers have begun using the term transmedium craft to describe objects like the one encountered in the Nimitz incident, because they appear capable of transitioning between air, water, and potentially space without any apparent difficulty. Commander Fravor has noted the churning water in his account many times. He does not speculate about what caused it, but he notes that the coincidence of a large underwater disturbance directly below a hovering unidentified object is not something that he has ever been able to explain away. Something caused that disturbance. Whatever it was large enough to create a visual anomaly visible from several thousand feet above. And it was directly associated, in time and location, with the object he then encountered hovering above it. Now let us discuss the psychological and professional impact of the Nimitz encounter on the individuals who were involved. This is an aspect of the story that is frequently overlooked in favor of the more dramatic elements of the encounter itself, but it is deeply important for understanding the full human dimension of what happened that November morning. Commander Fravor has been remarkably open about the fact that what he witnessed did not frighten him. He is a combat-trained naval aviator. He has flown in actual combat situations. His psychological and physiological response to threat is calibrated in a way that most people simply is not. What the encounter produced in him was not fear, but profound curiosity and a deep, abiding frustration that he was unable to get closer to the object before it disappeared. He wanted to know what it was. He still does. And the fact that he has never been given an answer, despite everything that has emerged since 2017, is a source of genuine frustration for him. Other witnesses to the encounter have described different emotional responses. Lieutenant Commander Alex Dietrich, Fravor's WSO, has stated that the encounter was unsettling in a way that she found difficult to articulate. She was struck by the object's apparent awareness of their presence, by the deliberate way in which it seemed to respond to their movements, as though it was not indifferent to them, but was specifically choosing how to interact with them. That sense of deliberate, intelligent response from an object of unknown origin is perhaps the most philosophically disquieting element of the entire encounter. It suggests not just unknown technology, but unknown intent. Kevin Day, the radar operator on the Princeton, who had been tracking the objects for 2 weeks before the November 14th encounter, has spoken about the experience in terms that suggest a much deeper psychological impact. He has described having recurring thoughts about what he witnessed. He has questioned the assumptions that he had built his understanding of the world upon. He has spoken about the difficulty of operating within a system, the United States Navy, that was officially telling him that what he had seen was not significant, while his own direct experience told him that it was perhaps the most significant thing he would ever witness. The tension between official denial and personal knowledge is one of the most psychologically corrosive experiences a person can have. And it is an experience shared by many of the men and women who were present on the Nimitz and the Princeton in November 2004. The question of why the United States government maintained official silence about the Nimitz encounter and others like it for so long is one that has been extensively discussed but never definitively answered. The most charitable explanation is that the government did not know what the objects were and did not want to create public panic, by admitting that unidentified objects were penetrating military airspace with impunity. There is a logic to this. If you cannot explain something, and if admitting that you cannot explain it would undermine public confidence in your ability to protect the nation, then silence might seem like the most responsible course of action. The less charitable explanation is that the government, or elements within it, knew considerably more about these objects than they were willing to admit publicly, and that the silence was maintained not to prevent panic, but to protect information that someone had decided the public did not need to know. Luis Elizondo, the former head of AATIP, has made statements that lean toward the less charitable interpretation. He has described what he characterizes as internal resistance within the Pentagon to taking the UAP phenomenon seriously, and he has suggested that this resistance was not simply institutional inertia, but something more deliberate. He has described a pattern of discouraging reporting, of marginalizing those who did report encounters, and of actively suppressing investigation. He resigned from the Pentagon because, in his words, he could no longer in good conscience be part of a system that was not taking seriously what he believed to be a genuine national security threat of unknown origin. The testimony of David Grush, a former intelligence officer who came forward in 2023 with perhaps the most explosive public claims ever made by a government insider on the subject of UAPs, adds another layer to this already complex picture. Grush testified before Congress that the United States government possessed, and had possessed for decades, both physical materials and what he described as non-human biologics recovered from craft of non-human origin. These claims have not been independently verified. They are the subject of ongoing investigation by multiple congressional committees. But the fact that they were made by a former intelligence officer with an apparently strong record and appropriate security clearances, in the formal setting of a congressional hearing and under penalty of perjury, has given them a weight that cannot simply be dismissed. Commander Fravor, for his part, has been careful not to go as far as Grush in his public statements. He deals in what he witnessed directly. He witnessed an object that could not be explained by any human technology he was aware of. He does not claim to know what it was. He does not claim that it was extraterrestrial. What he does say, with absolute consistency and conviction, is that the encounter was real, that the object was real, that it performed in ways that no known human technology could replicate, and that the United States government's response to that reality has been, at best, inadequate. The passage of the National Defense Authorization Act in recent years has included provisions requiring military pilots to report UAP encounters without fear of professional retaliation, and establishing formal mechanisms within the Department of Defense for collecting and analyzing those reports. These provisions exist because Congress was told, by credible military personnel, that there was a culture within the military of discouraging UAP reports, of treating pilots who reported encounters as eccentric at best and professionally unreliable at worst. The institutional response to UAP sightings had long been to suppress and discourage rather than to investigate and understand. The congressional action represents a formal acknowledgement that this approach was wrong, and that the phenomenon warranted serious, sustained investigation. What we are left with, more than 2 decades after Commander David Fravor climbed into his FA-18F Super Hornet on that clear November morning over the Pacific, is a set of facts that resist easy interpretation but demand serious attention. There were objects in restricted military airspace that no one could identify. They were tracked by some of the most sophisticated radar systems on the planet. They were observed directly by experienced military pilots. They were captured on infrared video. They performed maneuvers that defy the known laws of physics. The United States Navy officially confirmed they were real and unidentified. The United States Congress has taken them seriously enough to establish formal investigative programs and legal protections for those who report them. And the man who stands at the center of the most credible and most thoroughly documented of all these encounters, Commander David Fravor, continues to say, quietly and consistently, that what he saw that morning was the most extraordinary thing he had ever witnessed in a lifetime of extraordinary experiences, and that he still does not know what it was, and that whoever or whatever was operating that craft, they were watching him just as carefully as he was watching them. That last detail is worth returning to as we approach the end of this account. Because among all the extraordinary elements of the Nimitz encounter, among all the impossible physics and the government secrecy and the suppressed footage and the congressional hearings, it is that detail that perhaps carries the deepest weight. The object did not simply appear and then disappear. It interacted. It mirrored Fravor's movements. It positioned itself in response to his approach. It demonstrated an awareness of his presence that, whatever else you might believe about its origin and nature, suggested that the encounter was not simply a random crossing of paths. Something was paying attention. Something was making choices about how to respond to the presence of a United States Navy fighter jet. And then, having apparently decided that it had seen enough, it left. Where it went, we do not know. What it was, we do not know. Whether it will come back, we do not know. What we do know is that on November 14, 2004, high above the Pacific Ocean, something happened that changed the lives of everyone who witnessed it. Something happened that the most powerful military in the history of human civilization could not explain. Something happened that the United States government tried to suppress and eventually could not. Something happened that a generation of researchers, scientists, investigators, and curious citizens has spent 2 decades trying to understand. And something happened that Commander David Fravor, one of the finest military pilots of his generation, a man of unimpeachable character and extraordinary experience, has never been able to forget. He looked out of his cockpit on a clear November morning, and he saw something that should not exist. And in the doing of it, he became the most important witness in the long, strange, unresolved history of humanity's encounters with the unknown. The world is still watching the sky. And somewhere out there, something may still be watching back.